ที่เต็มไปด้วยการเปลี่ยนแปลงและความท้าทายขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของไทยอยู่ตรงไหนบนเวทีโลกเทคโนโลยีการศึกษาโครงสร้างพื้นฐานไทยต้องพัฒนาจุดไหนบ้างเพื่อเตรียมความพร้อมกับทุกการแข่งขันสวัสดีค่ะในการจัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของประเทศต่างๆทั่วโลกของปี 2567 ประเทศไทยอยู่อันดับที่ 25 จาก 67 เขตเศรษฐกิจทั่วโลกเป็นอันดับ 2 ในอาเซียนรองจากสิงคโปร์ซึ่งเป็นอันดับ 1 ของโลกอะไรคือปัจจัยที่ทำให้ประเทศต่างๆสามารถเพิ่มขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของตัวเองไทยเองมีจุดเด่นจุดด้อยอะไรและต้องพัฒนาต่อไปอย่างไรเราจะหาคำตอบจากศาสตราจารย์ดร. อาร์ทูโร บรีสผู้อำนวยการ IMD World Competitiveness Center ซึ่งเป็นสถาบันที่ประเทศสวิตเซอร์แลนด์ซึ่งเป็นผู้จัดอันดับขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันของประเทศต่างๆเป็นประจำทุกปีค่ะ IMD World Competitiveness Center จัดอันดับขีดความสามารถของเขตเศรษฐกิจ 67 แห่งทั่วโลกโดยวัดจากปัจจัยหลัก 4 ด้านได้แก่ สมรรถนะทางเศรษฐกิจประสิทธิภาพของภาคธุรกิจประสิทธิภาพของภาครัฐและโครงสร้างพื้นฐานโดยแต่ละด้านจะมีการแยกปัจจัยย่อยลงไปอีก 5 ด้านอย่างเช่นประสิทธิภาพภาครัฐจะมีการดูกรอบการบริหารภาครัฐและกฎหมายด้านธุรกิจหรือด้านโครงสร้างประเทศก็จะดูระบบสาธารณูปโภคและโครงสร้างด้านเทคโนโลยีเป็นต้นจุดประสงค์หลักของการให้คะแนนและจัดอันดับก็เพื่อเป็นเครื่องมือให้ประเทศต่างๆได้เห็นความก้าวหน้าและจุดที่ยังต้องปรับปรุงเพื่อทำให้เกิดการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจและนำมาซึ่งความเจริญรุ่งเรืองแก่ประชาชนของตัวเอง Professor Arturo, with AI and new technologies, does the definition of competitiveness of nations change?
Not really, because I think still competitiveness refers to the ability of a nation to generate prosperity for their people. I think the big question is how AI and new technologies are going to help economies become more prosperous. But we remain loyal to our idea of competitiveness, going beyond productivity and going beyond economic value and going much more into social and environmental value, prosperity in one word.
So in today's world, what are the major elements that can contribute to competitiveness?
At the end of the day, the key to having a competitive economy is that the economy generates jobs. So that's the first priority. Of course, creating jobs also implies that these jobs have to be productive enough. It's not a subsidized economy where you just create a public sector and then employ everybody. It's that you have an industrial policy that allows companies to create value, create jobs, and then those jobs allow people to have meaningful lives and earn a decent salary. Of course, for that to happen, then you need a series of conditions. And the competitiveness of a nation relies then on having the right infrastructure, meaning not only roads and airports, but also education, scientific infrastructure, healthcare. Second point, having a good government. In order to make sure that your salaries translate into taxes and taxes translates into the right investment, you need an efficient government, technologically advanced with the right values. And finally, to complement that, what you need is a buoyant private sector. And as I mentioned, you need companies, and then you need entrepreneurs and innovators with the right values and the right attitude that then allow the economy to develop and then to create jobs.
Is competitiveness the same as productivity? That sounds similar.
Historically, competitiveness was considered productivity. The World Economic Forum, in its earlier definition of competitiveness, defined it as the ability of a country to be productive. At the World Competitiveness Center at IMD, a step forward. And productivity is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, in the sense that you're going to have a productive economy with a very good system, industrial policy and technology, but that productivity needs to translate into prosperity. I mean, I can give you examples of countries that are extremely productive but not necessarily competitive. For example, countries in the Middle East. If you look at the top 5 most productive economies in the world, productivity of labor, they are all oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, but they're not necessarily competitive because such productivity maybe ends up in the hands of a very few, or such productivity is wasted. So there is one more step, is the extent to which the public sector translates that productivity into private wealth and disposable income and ultimately salaries.
What's the correlation between competitiveness and income level and quality of life?
Both are very highly correlated. One causes the other. The point is that if you enjoy a high quality of life and you are productive, then you are more competitive. But the opposite is true. What happens with competitive economies is that they are able to generate more prosperity. For example, they have better schools and better infrastructure. Switzerland, Singapore, Thailand, these are countries that because they grow in their competitiveness levels, then they make people better off. So the correlation is high, the causality is not clear. We tend to think that causality goes in one direction, but it actually goes in both. More prosperous countries are more productive and more competitive, but more competitive countries are also more prosperous and more productive.
For competitiveness to work, does it automatically translate into growth of a country?
Only in the long term. That is, what we have seen in our center is that economic growth is a very poor metric of competitiveness because you can grow the economy very easily. I give you one simple case. $1 spent by the government is $1 in additional GDP. So if I actually spend money in anything, like for example, I buy a TV for the office of a public official, then I'm increasing the country's GDP. So GDP is a very poor metric of performance. Yet, what you see in the long term is that most competitive countries tend to grow more. That's what I said earlier about the necessary and sufficient condition. There is a predictive power of competitiveness, and we have seen that in our center in many different academic studies and research that we have done, that when countries improve their competitiveness, then they grow faster in the long term. The opposite again may not be true, and I give you the counterexample. China has been the fastest growing country in the last 20 years, still is not in our top 10 most competitive economies, because economic growth is very easy to achieve. The question is how that economic growth translates into prosperity, and that's more difficult to achieve.
How do you measure competitiveness? Sometimes it sounds very abstract.
Because obviously, what we try to assess is not something that you can immediately assign a number to. GDP is very easy to measure. You can measure absolutely everything, including happiness. Competitiveness doesn't have a clear metric, so we need a methodology. And a methodology is by definition biased, in the sense that you need to make choices. We have been working for the last 34 years on that. So we think that we have a good methodology, but it's not the only one, and it can be contested. And as you know, there have been other institutions that try to measure competitiveness as well. We try to measure competitiveness by looking at all of these pillars that I mentioned earlier and try to look for indicators that try to, for example, grasp the quality of the public sector, the quality of the private sector, the quality of the country's infrastructure. And based on those more than 200 indicators, we just created a number around it that by itself doesn't have an absolute interpretation. That's why we translate it into a ranking. But it's certainly a big challenge. That measuring competitiveness is like, trying to measure the quality of a country's music. It's very difficult to actually compare Thai music with Brazilian music. One is not better than the other. But if you try to assess the quality with hard metrics, at the end of the day, you need to make choices.
10 ประเทศที่มีขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันสูงสุดในโลกสำหรับปี 2567 ได้แก่ สิงคโปร์ สวิตเซอร์แลนด์ เดนมาร์ก ไอร์แลนด์ ฮ่องกง สวีเดน UAE ไต้หวัน เนเธอร์แลนด์ และนอร์เวย์ ส่วนสหรัฐอเมริกาอยู่อันดับที่ 12 จีนอยู่อันดับที่ 14 ซาอุดิอาระเบียอยู่อันดับที่ 16 แคนาดา 19 และเกาหลีใต้ 20 I look at the rankings, Professor, and let's take the top 3 or even top 5. These are small economies like Singapore, Switzerland, Denmark. Small economies in terms of population and land area. So size does not matter at all concerning competitiveness?
In principle, you would expect bigger countries to be more competitive, because countries like the United States or China, they have massive economies of scale, they can actually invest with high returns. They also are well-diversified economies. They manufacture, they develop services, and then technologically advance. Yet we find, ironically, as you say, that the most competitive economies tend to be smaller. The reason why this happens is because in smaller economies it's much easier to implement economic strategies. That's it. Small economies like Singapore or Denmark, they build national consensus. They have very long-term strategies and policies that result from that consensus, and then they can develop their competitiveness models. If you think about what happens in the United States, for instance, there is so much political fragmentation that it's difficult to decide what is the right way forward. And entrepreneurs, they feel that. And innovating in those countries becomes more difficult because you don't know what is going to happen with your policy instability in the country. On the other extreme, you have China. China is a country that can build a vision, but that vision is not shared by the private sector. That is, you have a very authoritarian government that sets the path, but then embarking the private sector with you is much more difficult. And that's where the idea of consensus is built. Small nations have a much easier time to do that.
What are the lessons that we can learn from these small nations, yet very competitive?
One very important lesson to learn is that they have a clear idea about what is right to develop the economy. I call it earlier consensus. I come from a small country, Switzerland, where we have elections and where actually political parties in the parliament may change, but there is a clear agreement on what needs to be done, both by the public and the private sector.
Just now you mentioned the US and China. These are big countries that are competitive as well, among the top 20, I would say. What are the lessons that we can draw from big countries?
Well, these countries is much easier. They have economies of scale and they can invest very well. If you invest in a big highway, you are going to generate much more economic value in the United States than you would do it in Switzerland, because obviously there are more people that will benefit from that road. I think what we have learned from the large economies is that they are able to develop buoyant private sectors. I'm thinking Russia, that have not managed to develop those private sectors. China and the US, in different ways and with different models, they actually allow the private sector to pull from the economy. And that's a big lesson to learn as well.
สำหรับประเทศไทยอยู่อันดับที่ 25 ของโลกในปี 2567 ดีขึ้นกว่าปี 2566 5 อันดับ และเป็นที่ 2 ในอาเซียน รองจากสิงคโปร์ซึ่งอยู่ในอันดับ 1 ของโลก ส่วนอินโดนีเซียอยู่อันดับที่ 27 มาเลเซีย 34 และฟิลิปปินส์ 52 ไทยทำได้ดีขึ้นในปี 2567 เมื่อเทียบกับปี 2566 ในด้านสมรรถนะทางเศรษฐกิจและประสิทธิภาพของภาคธุรกิจแต่ด้านโครงสร้างพื้นฐานและด้านประสิทธิภาพของภาครัฐทำได้เท่ากับปี 2566 So for Thailand, where are we? Are we considered a middle country in terms of size, in terms of population?
Thailand is for us a large economy by the population, but it's also one of the most promising economies. This is what I have been calling winning losers. And let me explain what I mean is that these are these countries that have been ranked in the bottom half of our ranking of 64 economies, but have made an amazing progress in the last years. There is a drive by the government to make the economy more competitive. It's going to pay off. Unfortunately, as I always say, it doesn't happen from one year to the other. There's a lot of concern in Thailand about the rankings, but ranking improvements, rankings only reflect the true improvements in the economy. In the case of Thailand or in the case of any country, this takes time. This takes 1 or 2 generations. So Thailand is going to make a progress. I have no doubt that this country is going to be in the top 20 in a few years, maybe 10, 15 years. I think that's to me what is key. Whenever you come here, you see the energy and the drive to make things right, and then you pay attention to those indicators. We are not important because we're an institution that ranks Thailand. We give you a tool to design policies, and I think that's what Thailand does very well. This is a country that is not interested so much in improving the ranking. It's a country interested in improving the competitiveness of the country, which I think is more important.
For 2024, our ranking actually improved by 5 places, but the total score, we actually got less score. So what should we make out of it?
It's a methodological issue. It's difficult to actually interpret the scores because it's always relative to the top country. The most competitive country in 2024, Singapore, has scored 100. So then, in the case of Thailand, is that Thailand has become more competitive, but actually Singapore has become even more. So relatively speaking, the score deteriorates. But Thailand is making an amazing progress. All in all, what has happened in 2024 is that the entire region in Southeast Asia, countries including like Malaysia or Indonesia, they saw a rebound happening after the pandemic. our results for 2024 mostly reflect what happened in 2023. They are based on macroeconomic data from the year before. And then you saw how Southeast Asian economies, they caught up with the rest of the world in a very fast way in 2023, 2024. That's why you see the ranking of Thailand increasing so much. Also has to do with the secular trend of the country that has been improving in competitiveness gradually.
What did you see as the strongest points of Thailand?
So the strongest point is that fundamentally Thailand is an economy that is very well prepared to navigate the challenges of the future. When it comes to technology, digital transformation, all in all, with a large growing population, with a young population, the country is very well positioned to be even more competitive.
But we are an aging nation, actually. We're having a lot of seniors these days. Would that pose a big problem as well?
Yes, but you know, that's happening in all the countries in the world. That is triggering a different type of economic models. Because what happens is that with aging population, obviously productivity decreases, salaries decline because the young population come to the job market with the lower productivity and then lower salaries. That's a problem that we need to cope with. But I think technology is going to help us as well. With longevity, population aging, technology can contribute much more to people's prosperity.
What are areas for improvements for Thailand?
I think the key priority for Thailand should be the education and talent management system. This is a country that needs to invest more in education. That's actually something very easy to grasp, because you can see that when you look at the hard measures of education quality, investment in education as a percent of GDP, investment in education per student, the country is below world average. So there needs to be a bigger effort in the education system. That's always a problem, because the problem with education is that it's not a low-hanging fruit. Politicians are reluctant to invest in education because they don't see the benefits. I want to invest in something that allows me to be re-elected. It requires political leadership to focus on the education system. I think the second priority needs to be infrastructure. I think that the country has made a big effort, but the most developed economies and the most competitive economies, they put a lot of emphasis as well on physical infrastructure. We need to build a network of communications in the country that allows us to benefit from global trade. This involves roads, railways, airports, ports, physical infrastructure that, as you can see also, is not a low-hanging fruit, because it takes time to build and it takes time to pay off.
What about all the other factors like the role of the government, political stability, and corruption as well?
The quality of the public sector remains also low in our rankings. In the case of Thailand, one of the key initiatives that is taken is digitalization of public services. That, from other countries' experience, including, for example, Estonia or the United States, that one major driver of developing the public sector, reducing corruption, increasing transparency, increasing speed, and I think that's the only way. What we saw in the last years as well in Thailand was that the complexity in the public sector was increasing. This is a government that is structured in a way that makes it extremely complicated to coordinate. There are many ministries, many different departments, and I think only through technology we are going to solve that problem. So to me, the key initiative and what is going to be the driver of the success of this public sector in Thailand is going to be digitalization. E-government, you see in our digital rankings, then Thailand is also gradually improving as well. And we're going to see that it's going to drive also the overall competitiveness of the nation.
You have been doing this for so many years to do the rankings. Is education the most basic and most crucial building block for any countries to be competitive and successful, big or small?
Definitely yes. In the current economy, in the current world, where technology and intangibles play a fundamental role, the most important asset to preserve in an economy is brains and talent. The ability to innovate, education, skills. The problem again is that many countries overlook the role of education because they don't see the results. But looking back to the experience of successful countries, Singapore, Switzerland, Denmark, the United States, they have invested massively in education. Education is not primary education only. It's not about schools. It's also about universities. It's also the ability of companies to and upskill people. In the technology era, you don't stop educating yourself. So the extent to which companies also keep people trained is very important. not just the primary education system.
A lot of companies are focusing on the ESG concept, the environment, green, good governance concept. How does this fit into the bigger picture of a country's competitiveness?
That's a tough question. In principle, you will think that directly being socially responsible and environmentally friendly make you more competitive. That's essentially the definition of competitiveness, prosperity. If I live in a green environment with no pollution, then I'm more prosperous. So there's no doubt that ESG makes countries more competitive. The problem is that ESG requires some sacrifices or solving some dilemmas or some trade-offs. For example, if we want to transform our source of energy to make them sustainable, it requires big investments. Some countries, for example in Europe, they are going to net zero transition to move from fuel or fossil fuel sources of energy to solar or wind. And that investment, of course, comes at the expense of something else. The national budget is not unlimited. Some countries, especially after the pandemic, have decided to go for the economic advantages at the expense of the social or environmental advantages. I give you one example. Indonesia was a country that performed extremely well in our rankings, but what the country did after the pandemic was to focus on fossil fuels and coal as one of their major exports at the expense of sustainability. That's a reasonable choice if you want to make people's life better off. But that's what you see the dilemmas of the future. Sustainability requires trade-offs, and solving those trade-offs in the best possible way is the only way to actually make sure that it drives the competitiveness of the nation.
ศาสตราจารย์อาร์ทูโรเปรียบเทียบว่าภาครัฐกับภาคเอกชนก็เหมือนจักรยานกับคนขี่ที่ต้องเข้าขากันเพื่อสร้างความรุ่งเรืองให้ประเทศและสิ่งสำคัญก็คือประเทศจะต้องมีวิสัยทัศน์และยุทธศาสตร์ที่ชัดเจนในการส่งเสริมให้ภาคเอกชนได้ใช้ความคิดสร้างสรรค์ในการเกิดนวัตกรรมใหม่ๆค่ะ In a society, let's say Thailand, the government, the private sector, civil society, who would play the most major role in contributing to competitiveness? Is it the government? Must they always lead? Or how does it work?
I learned this metaphor here in Thailand actually, that the competitiveness of a nation is like riding a bicycle. You need a good bicycle and you need a good cyclist. So the bicycle is the government, the bicycle is the state, the bicycle is the infrastructure of the country. You need to have a good bicycle, high quality, fast. But a fast bike without a cyclist is nothing. So the cyclist is the private sector. Is the corporate sector, is companies that create jobs. The cyclists need to be in good shape, needs to train, needs to actually have a vision and know what the end game is going to be. And finally, interestingly as well, you need that the cyclist and the bicycle match each other. If the bicycle is too big for the cyclist or the cyclist is too big for the bicycle, it will ride slow. So you need that for a particular public sector, you need a particular private sector and vice versa. They need to work together. They need to be complementary. You need both. There are some countries that they only rely on the public sector, Venezuela, that are not competitive at all. You have some countries that only rely on the private sector and they actually have fragmented, corrupted or inexisting governments. I'm thinking, for example, on some African economies, some Latin American economies, then they don't work either. You need a combination of both.
For the private sector, how can businesses remain competitive?
So obviously they need the umbrella of the government. I don't mean subsidies, they mean regulation. So you need to live in a good regulatory environment where rule of law operates. Once this happens, once you have leveled the playing field and once you have a regulation that helps you make decisions, then the role of the private sector is to innovate, is to think about technology in a human way, to what extent technology is going to help me generate prosperity for the nation and jobs. When we look at artificial intelligence today, very often companies think of AI solutions as a way to reduce costs, that it's going to allow me to fire people. That's not the right way to go if you want to build a competitive nation. So how we use technology to generate prosperity, and then finally, how my mission as a company fits the vision of the nation as well. So am I doing something that will contribute to the whole country, by making use of the country's natural resources or the country's talents? Otherwise, I'm trying to create a new industry that doesn't fit in the country. So how can I actually complement the country's strengths with my company?
When we look into the future, Professor, what are some of the trends that might affect competitiveness?
I think you have mentioned some of them. One of them definitely sustainability. This net zero transition is going to be key for the next years. And I strongly believe that this is not something that companies can do by themselves. It requires a national collaboration. It needs to be regulated. You cannot impose social responsibility on companies. Second important trend is definitely technology, artificial intelligence in particular, how AI is going to contribute to the competitiveness of nations. And finally is the war for talent. In this new economy where sustainability and technology play this new role, there is a new need for talent as well. And the ability of countries to develop and attract the talent that they need is going to be key. Because as I said earlier, the intangible asset of a country, talent and skills, is going to drive, at the end of the day, the tangibles of the economy, manufacturing, production, and so on. To what extent the country like Thailand, for example, manages to preserve the quality of its talent pool.
How can countries remain competitive?
At the end of the day, it requires a vision and national consensus. As with a company, strategies do not happen in isolation. That is, it's not that you are successful by pure luck. Gone are the times when the success of a nation depended on natural resources. When you had natural resources, you were rich. I'm talking about the 18th and the 17th century. Now, if you want to be competitive, you need to have a clear strategy that will drive talent, infrastructure, technology, and that actually requires long-term view and a vision.
How can I or anybody as an individual remain competitive?
Well, first of all, understanding what are the strengths of the economy, and then taking a personal responsibility when it comes to preserving the nation's competitiveness. Am I environmentally friendly? Do I actually consume the right products? Am I contributing to my nation's economy by, for example, buying and using the services that my country is ready to offer? Am I upskilling myself enough? That is, do I know what needs to be done? In a context of technological development, am I learning enough about AI or about Web3 or about any other development? Am I sustainable as an individual? All of these forces that operate at the national level can also be taken at the individual level.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your time today. Muchísimas gracias.
De nada.
ศาสตราจารย์อาร์ตูโรย้ำนะคะว่าการศึกษาและการเรียนรู้เพิ่มทักษะตลอดเวลาเป็นสิ่งสำคัญในการเพิ่มขีดความสามารถในการแข่งขันให้กับประเทศการลงทุนด้านการศึกษาอาจจะต้องใช้เวลานานนะคะกว่าจะเห็นผลแต่ต้องทำค่ะเพราะว่าการสร้างคนให้มีคุณภาพก็คือการสร้างมันสมองให้กับประเทศมีความพร้อมในการรับมือกับความเปลี่ยนแปลงต่างๆที่เกิดขึ้นในโลกสวัสดีค่ะ